Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. My guest tonight is Jay Dyer. He returns. How are you doing, Jay?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm excellent, Jay. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Sure.
And, of course, tonight, we want to focus mainly on your book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. But, of course, you're the proprietor of Jay's Analysis, and that's jaysanalysis.com. Go to his website, and if you enjoy his work, you can always sign up for a membership for a mere pittance, less than $5 a month, from what I understand. So, okay, well, last time we spoke, we talked about you had just coming close to concluding your lecture series on tragedy and hope. And I think you already summarized that. And on tragedy and hope, what's the big takeaway from Carroll Quigley's tome, his magnum opus?
The big takeaway is, if I were to summarize it briefly, that democracy in the Western sense is the greatest hope for the world, and despite the wars and tragedies that we've had, we can still save the world with this fuzzy sort of ideology that in Quigley's mind in some way is born out of the Western Catholic tradition, which I don't actually buy that argument, but in his mind it's some sort of loosely influenced notion of human rights and, as I said, some form of democracy or populism, and that these fuzzy notions can still be projected onto the rest of the world, but we don't ever, because Quigley is a military historian and not really a theologian, although he does actually in the end of the book hit on a couple theological insights that sort of line up with things that Dr. Joseph Farrell has talked about in his theology books, God, History, and Dialectic. There's, as a whole, the book is an instruction manual, a kind of apologetic to tell members of the establishment that what we're doing is ultimately for the good. And yeah, there's going to be bumps along the road, but we can still revive this corpse of Western democracy, is I guess the only way I could think of summarizing the book. And that's how that's how it ends, more or less. So tragedies occur, but the hope comes out of the Western idea. And of course, I disagree with. I don't think that democracy is the Western idea. I mean, people will say, "Oh, we go back to Greece or something." I don't think that Greece is necessarily like the high point of civilization. But in Quigley's mind, that Atlanticism can play a salvific role, and he even admits the dangers of the coming technocratic managerial society. He says it's more or less inevitable, but he sees it as also dangerous to, quote, democracy and all that. So that's what the book's about.
And, of course, the revelation, which most people are familiar with, is he talks about this elite circle or group of people primarily operating out of London, but also Washington now.
In New York, yeah.
In New York, and this is what he terms the bankocracy, the banksters,
yeah,
financial elite.
The New England Atlanticist axis that establishment Cliveden set tied into the elite of London, and he doesn't say much about the Vatican. Interestingly, he does mainly talk about the geopolitical motives of London and New York and Washington, but and Wall Street. But yeah, that is that private clique that is behind, that is a kind of dynasty still. I think you could argue that. He makes it a little more realistic in the sense of different banking empires and houses and dynasties. But it's more or less the same banking power that has been in charge even back to the time of the Enlightenment and French Revolution. So the revolutionary period that we've been undergoing in Western civilization from that time, according to Quigley, roughly, is a monetarist banker revolution. And so those bankers are still more or less in charge. And the changes in society can ultimately be traced to their influence through their many legates and outlets, including foundations and NGOs. And, it's really in the period that Quigley is writing that the NGO is starting to come into existence. I think in the Latin America chapter towards the end, he discusses under JFK, the Alliance for Progress, and this was kind of an NGO set up under JFK in tandem with the CIA to kind of influence all the economic and governmental policy in Latin America. And now it apparently wasn't that successful, according to Quigley, but that is kind of the model, right, of how things are happening, even now that we see in Syria or Ukraine, and we think of, Soros's group, National Endowment for Democracy, and then this kind of on the RAND model, the think tank model, right? So these are all kind of it's like I was telling somebody, I forget who told me this, but we're talking about the CIA and Wall Street, and we were saying, well, what is I think it was Henrik, how do you understand the CIA? The CIA are basically worker bees for Wall Street and the banking elites, right? So they're not James Bond.
Yeah, that's what Fletcher Prouty more or less concluded.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
the secret team. So that's what Quigley's book's about, is about explaining the 20th century in its real story to people who are going into the establishment.
And now we look at, again, it's with Tragedy and Hope we look at it as a sort of revelation, but it was written as sort of an in-house guidebook, or
right.
For elites, people who are in the State Department, CIA, maybe DOD, maybe Wall Street.
Maybe Wall Street, right? Yeah,
and so, but it was also a justification. Instead of he's revealing this stuff, it's an apologetic for the ruling elite. You had a recent interview with F. William Engdahl, and you were discussing the book, and he had it on his shelf. Apparently, he had read it too. So there's two people who actually talking together actually read Tragedy and Hope. That's probably the first time in history that's happened. They read the actual book from cover to back, but front to back. But he made an interesting point regarding. Apparently, he said that Quigley was given conditional access to the CFR archives. They would not emphasize or mention the name Rockefeller.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to spark a debate. Rockefellers are mentioned more than once.
Okay,
but Professor Engdahl's correct that they are not emphasized in the book at all.
Yeah,
which is curious, because if you read David Rockefeller's memoirs, or if you read Collier and Horowitz's authorized biography of the Rockefellers, they obviously play a huge role.
Yes.
So yeah, that's just, and I've noticed this a lot of times when you read these kind of big puzzle piece books, even in those, you're still only getting partial picture. Now, obviously that's all of us being human, we're limited and finite, so we're always going to have a partial picture to some degree. But even in these, giant tomes and revelations and exposés, there can often be big pieces of the picture missing.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you read on the JFK, or not JFK, the Diana situation, Princess Diana, I've looked at several different books, and then if you look at Gordon Thomas's book on the Mossad, there's some very interesting details that pop up in his book in the first chapter that I haven't found elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So you see what I'm saying? Like this kind of, you'll find puzzle pieces in different books. So if you were to read Tragedy and Hope and, say, David's memoirs, the two would complement each other very well, as would Psychological Warfare and the New World Order. Yeah. Because he spends the first 100 or 200 pages talking about the CFR.
And also the whole idea of dialectics and controlled opposition, what you're alluding to there. That's Servando Gonzalez's book regarding Castro, who just passed away, and He makes a very good case because he analyzes Castro, I think, as an intelligence analyst, not as an historian. And intelligence analysts, you don't take things at face value. Historians often take things at face value.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Yeah, so
I love that point that he made at the beginning there, and having done an undergrad in history, I understand that point, because in my history classes, we never covered that. We never talked about different approaches to how you read history. And it was almost always like we might do a historiography or something like that, where you come up with a whole bunch of different sources on a certain topic, and then you kind of try to separate wheat from chaff and figure out what the closest thing to the truth might have been in some event or person's past or something. But you never talk about the possibility of disinformation. Now, if governments engage in disinformation, which they do and they have for millennia, then you would think that would be an important aspect to the approach that the historian takes. And so I think Servando is totally correct.
Or when you study political science, there's no course on, say, underground criminal cartels.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah.
Or secret societies in general.
Yes.
The notion of a synarchy, of a shadow government.
Yeah, in my French Revolution class, there was only now, to be fair, R.R. Palmer, who's a famous French Revolution historian, he at least does admit in one paragraph of his book on the French Revolution and Napoleon that yes, there was a kind of Masonic illuminist role in the French Revolution. So, but the rest of the books, and we had quite a few in that class, it wasn't really mentioned. The professor mentioned it kind of in passing. Now, I would think that would be pretty important if the philosophy that's enacted at the French Revolution is based on the philosophy of the secret society behind it.
Yeah, because there's a Black Hand, there's an organization called the Black Hand, which precipitated a very, very major event in Western history, World history.
War I, right?
Yeah. So, and that concept where it gets brushed aside as conspiracy theory, wacko stuff, and all, unless they want to, promote a Cold War, then they'll say, right. there's a communist under every pillow, and and that conspiracy is acceptable. There's acceptable conspiracy. So, but it was the idea that because de-emphasizing the Rockefellers, because historically I understood it was the early part of the 20th century. You could divide American politics into two camps. There was the House of Morgan and Rockefeller, and by the 1930s, the Rockefeller House had eclipsed Morgan and kind of absorbed it, and the elite became more unified in the 30s and 40s, which what you see. So that's an interesting point.
Well, they dominate all these things. They dominate the CIA. They dominate CFR. I think Gonzalez points out that even prior to the CIA, the OSS, you have the Inquiry, which is these academics. The Rockefellers dominate medicine. They dominate academics. They dominate seminaries, especially Protestant seminaries that they buy off. So, absolutely.
And I think they even started the American Historical Association, or at least funded it.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know that.
I think they got a role in the American psych. The same as in sociology comes out of the University of Chicago, which is a Rockefeller operation.
Yeah.
So
that I did know there. That's a whole created discipline straight from.
And it's awful social engineering.
Absolutely.
So, but anyway, I want to give you some kudos for that whole series. It was quite an accomplishment, and I enjoyed it immensely. I enjoyed talking to you about it. I want to thank you for coming on so many times to talk about it.
Well, I'm honored that you allowed me to come on and talk about it so many times. Nobody else did. Nobody else.
Oh, it's fascinating how people pass that up. No one. I interviewed Bill Plummer, or not Bill Plummer.
Joe.
Bill Plummer was a catcher in the 70s for the Cincinnati Reds. Joe Plummer. Joe Plummer. And his book is very good because it's an intro thing. It's sort of like an outline. Mm-hmm. He gives it a certain look, but your analysis goes in much deeper. It's a completely different approach, I think, which again is for anyone to add something different to this is quite an accomplishment. It's value added research.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I intend to kind of continue with that model and maybe do some more of these big tomes, some Brzezinski or something like that next, or maybe Grand Chessboard or something like that.
And if it sparks interest and tempts other scholars or intellectuals to look at the book and even offer competing theories, we're all enriched by it. And that's the important thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not to point fingers at each other saying you're a shill, you're wrong. No, read it yourself and offer up because there might be some more insights into this tome.
Mm-hmm.
That's the value of this stuff. So it was great work. Now you have your book recently came out, Esoteric Hollywood: Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. And you sent me the PDF, so it gave me a chance to read through it, and I'd say it was a very enjoyable read. Excellent,
okay, good.
Well written, and the way it's constructed is excellent because you have these sidebars, they explain things, and for the typical reader who might just be curious about this stuff, for someone who's more familiar with it, it's very helpful too, because it refreshes stuff and expels things out, names, philosophers, and ideas, and how it impacts how these ideas have been applied. In Hollywood and entertainment and culture in general, but it's also very good for someone who isn't familiar with it, So it was like I said, it's for both the layperson and someone a notch above the layperson in this topic. It's very useful. So
good.
And something it was hard to put down. So
well, that's what I was going for. I really wanted to be able to speak to, like you said, not just the man on the street, but also, persons who were familiar with the topics and try to expand kind of what was already out there. But there's also, I noted, a lot of people might have read one of my analyses, but they hadn't read, the 20 or 30 other ones that are in the book. So I think people will be interested in like the first 90 or so pages on Kubrick, and then you got another 70 or 80 on Spielberg movies, and then you got, kind of a satirical, goofy section on 80s movies, and Hitchcock. So I think it'll have a broad appeal with just the popularity of those directors. But I also chose analyses that I thought were that had an important message, and I think that I really wanted to make an argument against scientism. That was a big part of why I included that H.G. Wells section in the book.
Because Hollywood plays a big role in promoting it.
It does, and a lot. We tend to think of things. There's all the occult, and Hollywood promotes Satanism and the occult and transgender, and it does. And I do touch on those topics, especially the esoteric stuff. But we can't forget that the Darwinian mythology, which is a big part of the establishment.
Yes.
Social engineering has been promoted by Hollywood.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say most of these science fiction stories are really kind of grounded in that mythos.
Mm-hmm. From the dust jacket, it reads, or from the back of the book rather, because it's soft cover. Like no other book before it, this work delves into the deep, dark, mysterious undertones hidden in Tinseltown's biggest films. Esoteric Hollywood is a game changer in an arena of tabloid-populated titles. After years of scholarly research, Jay Dyer has compiled his most read essays, combining philosophy, comparative religion, symbolism, and geopolitics, and their connections to film. Readers will watch movies with new eyes, able to decipher on their own as the secret meanings of cinema are unveiled. So there you go. That's a great summation. So,
thanks. Yeah, that was actually more difficult to write than you would think. I forget what that was. I think that was for the initial proposal. That's what I wrote, and I was thinking, well, how would you summarize like what, say 20 or 30 of these film analyses? What are they? They're kind of all over the place, but it worked out.
But you start out the first chapter is I like what you did an interview with Hendrick, and he's talking about Hollywood, and he described what is Hollywood, and he says, I think he described it, I'm going to paraphrase it, something like as a virus placed in the mental software of humanity. Yeah. And that a virus, that is a good way to put it. Now you start out the first chapter is the occult empire and film as ritual, and this handles Kubrick, Eyes Wide Shut, and the occult empire and film as ritual. You want to explain that?
Well. one of the things that if you're into theology is that you, or especially the more classical theologies of Orthodoxy or Catholicism, then you understand life as ritual because you have a church calendar, and the church calendar is kind of what we were in Christendom supposed to live by. And then, of course, the secular calendar was put in place for the time of the French Revolution, where they first tried this, and then subsequent versions of this where you're given civic saints and you're given Martin Luther King Day and you're given all this kind of stuff to be a replacement of the older notion of the church calendar, which shows, by the way, man's fundamental religious nature, by the way. Why are you having to create a civic religion if man is not fundamentally religious? And
you make that very important point in the book, yeah.
So film as ritual is another aspect of this this phenomena of man's being, where he reflects his religious aspects of his being, not just in his church, but also in his art. Or in his worship. So his artwork is also part of his religious philosophy, his worldview. And it's going to necessarily reflect what man believes, whether he acknowledges it or is cognizant of it or not. And, the same could be said of architecture, right? We think about architecture reflecting the norms and values of a society, and that's why you get all this hideous Bauhaus and modernist abstract art nowadays. Whereas if you look back to something, say, in the Baroque period, obviously much more beautiful, and it reflects hierarchy and things like that. That was more normative for those societies in terms of their presuppositions. But so film as ritual is one angle of man's artwork, and it's particularly powerful. Because as we've talked about in the past, I think the first time you had me on, we talked about Plato and the cave and how, the ability of storytelling through film to combine, sound and sight and music and editing and manipulation of time and all that becomes a very powerful means that led to the usage of film and propaganda, film as a means of propaganda on the part of the establishment. But what I do is I keep it in the context of religious philosophy and comparative religion in this first section. And I talk about Mircea Eliade, who's a famous comparative religion scholar, and he's written some really good books. Sacred and the Profane is a really good book. And he discusses the notion of threshold and of the sacred space and things like that for mankind, throughout time. And we could look at Hollywood as a version of that, where you have this, if we set aside Christian thought for a moment and we think about just life in America, well, a lot of people grow up thinking that Hollywood is this sort of grandiose, make your dreams come true type place where, like, if you've seen L.A. Confidential, that movie, there's a beginning of the film where there's a monologue that Danny DeVito reads, where he talks about Hollywood, the greatest place on earth. All your dreams will come true. If and the point of the movie there at the beginning of LA Confidential is actually to promote tourism or actually to promote people moving to LA and Hollywood, to build it up, for economic reasons and so forth. And that was back in the 30s or 40s was when the movie takes place. A really good movie, by the way, with Russell Crowe and Aaron Eckhart. But so film as ritual is the notion of Hollywood as a kind of empire. And it has become a kind of empire. It's a magical wonderland of creating the synthetic, right? Of becoming the new Olympus, of the source from which people nowadays tend to derive the meaning of their lives. And because humans don't derive meaning from, bare scientism and facts, right? We don't read Newton's Principia and say, now we've discovered the meaning of life. Because it doesn't give meaning, it just gives explications of how, right? Like cause and effect. right? Well, cause and effect doesn't give you a meaning, because meaning, I believe, assumes or points to the eternal, and you'll never get something eternal from only the temporal or only material, right? It has to always point beyond it, I believe. And Hollywood and film, I don't think it was initially going to be that. When Edison created the camera, or was involved in developing the camera, and there was the sort of early experiments done where they chopped off people's heads, and people thought it was real on the film reels, and the famous instance of the train coming at the crowd, and the people thought the train was real. I think they started noticing, in the beginning of the invention of it, that it could be used for this, and so what you had was a form of art that could have been, and probably was for a while, positive in its effects, but very quickly began to be utilized for something dark. And as Henrik said in the interview, whether you believe in real demons and black magic and voodoo or not, the effect of Hollywood can be the same. And so what Hollywood does is kind of put everybody under this voodoo spell, this magic spell of believing the mythology and believing the lies about it. Think, for example, of the idea that, if you're good and talented in the arts, and if you go out to LA or something, or, this older mythology, you'll be successful if you're good and talented. When the reality is that the way that people climb the top of that ladder often puts them into pornography. They often end up addicted to drugs, prostitution, right? It's more like a mafia or a cartel.
Yeah, that's Lynch's Mulholland Drive.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. I believe that's the point of that film.
Yeah,
and so that's why I talk about it as a ritual, is that it's a kind of dark ritual, and I think the establishment understood from the perspective of social engineering that they would have to. Well, if you think about full spectrum dominance, F. William Engdahl's book. Full spectrum dominance isn't just a geopolitical motive of, containing Russia or something. It also includes the arts, and this is what we've seen for so long with the Frankfurt School, and that we've talked about in our circles many times in interviews, is this influence of these say the Rockefeller Foundation and the OSS working with the Frankfurt School to engineer art, and recruiting people like Jackson Pollock and Andy Warhol to produce this weird, bizarre, and ultimately degrading art down the road that would have a direct effect on mankind and how he viewed himself and viewed the world. And that's actually what some of the Frankfurt School people say. That they say that bestiality and necrophilia could be, if this becomes quote art, right, then this can have a powerful effect on society. And there's a lot of different takes on this and articles, and some people call it aesthetic terrorism, where you kind of induce trauma through the arts. So all of that is kind of what I'm dealing with in the book. And I talk about Foucault, and the reason Foucault's postmodernism is relevant is because he said that basically this Enlightenment idea that we would move away from superstition and priestcraft, and that we would get instead this kind of learned society where everybody was a citizen journalist and looking at the facts and all this nonsense that didn't ever transpire. Foucault pointed out that we still live in a priestly society, right, with hierophants and shepherds, as he called it in one of his famous essays. And the shepherds, he talks about, in that essay, I think he talks about them being the scientific class, right, the quote scientists. But the same could be said for the myth makers, and that's what we would get with Hollywood. Hello?
Sorry, go ahead. I had my hit my.
No, that's all. I was just going to close there with the point about Foucault and what his point was.
Yeah. And that's the myth makers, the cultural mandarins, the people who can tell a good story or have technology at their disposal, particularly special effects. And that's what the big thing of the cinema is, because the psychological warfare, the great potential of this of that became, of course, with the motion picture. and that fundamentally changed things like
Yes.
like pornography.
Right.
You know.
Well, and in chapter 1, after that introduction, everybody I think has probably heard of the book if they haven't looked at it. It's kind of a boring book because it's all about these like 20s and 30s era people that nobody remembers anymore. Kenneth Anger's Hollywood Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And of course he was, a Satanist and a Luciferian and in the circles of Crowleyanism and so forth. And what Anger did was kind of present Hollywood as a resurrection of the ancient pagan empire of Babylon. And that is appropriate, especially if you've been to LA or Hollywood and, you've seen the big Babylonian gate from the what's the movie it's now a shopping mall. I was just there a few months ago.
Oh, that like the silent movie?
Yes. Yeah.
Is it Temptation or something? Or
something like that. Yeah. And so it's very ironic, right? I mean, and there's all kinds of, you could do a whole book just on the architecture and Masonic and occultic symbology of Hollywood. We went to the Griffith Observatory and it's all completely Masonic. Anyway, but the reason I was talking about that was that what I wanted to do with the book was kind of be a sort of like Hollywood Babylon, but kind of a corrective to it, like a different take on the point that Kenneth Anger is making in his book.
Yeah, it was Joseph Brain who led the production code for the first 20 years of his existence, and he had this quote. He said about Hollywood. He goes, They are a simple, rotten bunch of vile people with no respect for anything beyond making money. Here, in Hollywood, we have paganism rampant in its most virulent form. Drunkenness and debauchery are commonplace. Sexual perversion is rampant. Any number of our directors and our stars are perverts. Yeah. Then he focuses on, of course, the one ethnic group that dominates Hollywood, the Jews. He said the Jews seem to think of nothing about money-making and sexual indulgence. The vilest kind of sin is a common indulgence hereabouts. And the men and women who engage in this sort of business are the men and women who decide what the film fare of the nation is to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the importance of the production code. Is sort of it kept Hollywood on a short leash for a while.
Now, what's interesting, you mentioned that code. At the beginning of Hollywood Babylon, that's what an admittedly wicked guy himself says about Hollywood.
Yeah.
He himself says, yes, it's absolutely 100% a perverse, degenerate racket, really. And that's why you've seen ties into the mob. That's why you've seen all manner of perversion. That's why it's now the champion of pushing the whole gay and transgender agenda.
And it's almost like I've always thought if you look at Hollywood and how the seedier side, the underbelly of what really goes on, and same thing with Las Vegas, you get a glimpse of how America really operates.
Exactly. There you go. That's Vegas is it's kind of the theme park addendum appendix to Hollywood.
Now, I just want to mention this. I was just watching some clips on YouTube from the movie Casino.
Yes.
Of course, it's fictional characters that are based on very real people.
Right.
And I didn't catch this. I know you've been reading Program to Kill.
Yes.
And Dave McGowan's thesis regarding at least one aspect of the serial killer phenomenon.
Right.
Another version of Murder Incorporated.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't catch this at first when I've seen the movie a couple times. But you remember the scene where Pollock plays the clean face, the kind of the puppet who owns the casino? And he's kind of like the president of the United States, getting off the plane, ask questions. And he has this middle-aged lady who was like a silent investor that no one knew, the mob didn't know about.
Uh-huh.
And she's starting to ask questions about the books. And he can't brush her off anymore. So she takes him to court and sues him and wins. And they have to open up all the books. And it goes through this narration of how it's handled with the mob, the boys back in Kansas City. And the kid says, this isn't good, man. They open the books, they can find out where the funding came from, the Teamsters and all that stuff.
Uh-huh.
And the mob says, so the narrator goes, so the bosses decided to settle the case out of court.
Oh, right.
So the scene where she's drinking her coffee in the morning in her kitchen, and then comes in this hitman and takes her out with 6 bullets in the head. And the next scene is Pollock, who Mr. Green, I think is his name, I think in the movie, comes out and they start questions about his investor who just died. He doesn't know anything about it. He's obviously shocked by the news, and he starts saying, well, we just did some business deals together, we weren't really partners, blah, blah, blah. But at the last second, the reporter goes, does this have anything to do with the .22 caliber killer? You know, like a serial killer.
Wow.
You know, it's like, wait a second, that's out of that thing, you know, they're blaming it on a serial killer.
Wow, yeah. I saw Casino, you know, when it came out back in the 90s or whatever, so I'd totally forgotten all that.
So, wow, that's interesting. It just, at the last minute, does this have anything to do with the .22 caliber killer? Mm-hmm. You know, like the Bind, Torture, and Kill killer, or, you know, or
yes, BTK,
Jeffrey Dahmer, or, you know, whatever. But go ahead, I thought that was interesting. But how, you know, basically, we get a glimpse of what's really going on through Las Vegas, through Hollywood, and how it is sort of a microcosm for how the world is really run in many respects.
Yeah, and until you understand the whole black market aspect of the economy, with drugs and human trafficking and all that, and the prostitution, you know, you really don't get the quote New World Order.
Yeah, and I was just rereading Catherine Austin Fitz's Dylan Reed and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits, and about how it was laundered drug money which financed the RJR Nabisco merger of the 80s.
Oh wow!
And there's a European Community lawsuit. At least there's an accusation to that effect. How, you know, they were just laundered. They just send, you know, carts and carts of cigarettes over to Europe, and the drug dealers would buy the cigarettes, and the cash would go in their RJR Nabisco's coffers. Yeah,
well, that's essentially what I get into, and not that specific case, but that model in the Spectre section of the book, then the Quantum of Solace section.
Yes, and that's Now, this is Hollywood. Now, you examined Kubrick, particularly a couple of his movies, Eyes Wide Shut and 2001: Space Odyssey,
and The Shining,
and The Shining. I'm sorry, yeah. Now, in Eyes Wide Shut, you proffer the idea that it is both a revelation and an initiation of the public. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I have seen Kubrick make kind of off-the-cuff esoteric references. He does talk about magic and fairy tales and telling magical stories. Now, he says that those are more real than, quote, reality. So that to me suggests, you know, Kubrick may have had some idea of, you know, Kabbalistic teaching or something like that, or probably knew about Masonic ideas. So I don't think that it's far-fetched to propose that kind of a theory about Eyes Wide Shut, especially when we see the same kind of esoteric metaphysical themes popping up in, say, 2001. So what I argue is that the story with Bill Harford, and this is, of course, based on a German novella, Austrian novella, Traumnovelle, by Arthur Schnitzler, and you have this sort of willing fool or dupe who's led down this path into understanding that he's not running things. I think you and I have talked about this in the past, that the real message of the story is that the people out there, you know, that even those that might think that they're at the top of the food chain, the nouveau riche or the upper middle class doctor or somebody like this, they're not really in charge. And it's people more like Soros, right, who are running things. And that's totally what we've seen, especially with WikiLeaks. And I mean, we already kind of knew this. Soros has bragged openly about all the color revolutions and things that he's manufactured and manipulated, right, on a global scale.
Yeah, he's a magus, right?
And Soros wrote his book, Alchemy of Finance. So I don't think that it's totally out of step with even Soros. But so what is going on in Eyes Wide Shut? I think that he's not. I mean, there's several things going on. So Kubrick's not just playing with surrealism and levels of reality and dream states and things like that. That's all part of it. But he's also telling us that there is a way in which people are brought into the power structure and they're compromised. And that's, I think, especially relevant with what we've seen with Pizzagate and the Epstein, Little St. James Island, and all this stuff with WikiLeaks and the Clintons and the Podestas and all that. It's very appropriate to what we see in Eyes Wide Shut, because Bill's curiosity, that's the Tom Cruise character, Bill Harford, it leads him down this path where he thinks he's achieving freedom. And the irony, of course, is that the more he goes down this dangerous path of trying to find out who's in this whole sex cult thing, he discovers that his whole reality is manipulated, that everything he's believed was a lie. And I think you and I have discussed in the past, and it comes up in my book, it's very similar to the story of the Magus by John Fowles, where you have the willing dupe who arrogantly thinks he understands everything, and then he doesn't understand this larger level of manipulation and control by these oligarchs, moneyed elite and old money. With you get the impression that in the Eyes Wide Shut situation, that because it requires an ermine cloak, and this is the cloak worn by the royalty in Europe, and because of the British accent of the Hierophant, or whatever this sort of cult leader guy is here, right, that it's a tie-in to old money. And this is also another theme in Kubrick movies. This is a theme in Barry Lyndon, with the main character trying to get into that class of people, and he's just not welcome because he's not blood, right? So the only other way into that group is to be new money, but that takes a while, and it's not easy to obtain billions of dollars. And so, in other words, this is what Bill's learning, and that is the message of the film that we, in the public, don't know and don't learn. Or at least when Kubrick was making this film, I think he would have said, you out there in the audience, your eyes are wide shut to how the world really works. And again, as I pointed out with Henrik, the cult, we talked about this many times. I talk about it in the book. The cults are very similar to intelligence agencies and the trafficking of secret information. And this ties in well to your point about the mafia and blackmail, because this cult in the film has at its disposal all the means of an intelligence agency. They're able to craft the news story about the dead beauty pageant girl. They're able to tail Bill Harford around town. They're able to put Swallows, sex operatives in his life, domino. Right? I mean, they have all these means at their disposal. And so they, for all intents and purposes, might as well be. So maybe intelligence agencies actually operate like a cult. Maybe that's what's really going on. But so I dive into the symbolism, and it has a lot of the sort of classical tropes of mind control, like Over the Rainbow and Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland, with the Nicole Kidman character. And I mentioned, a couple of examples of Dominique Strauss-Kahn and the Dutroux affair, where we've seen glimpses of this kind of stuff going on with the power elite. So I also get into kind of the notion of rituals and gender and rebirth, and how there's this sort of in all paganism, there's always the obsession with the generative principle and the birth cycle and nature, right? Because it always ends up in nature worship. That's really what it is. And what is the most potent force in nature? Well, sex and recreation, right? Or generation. So I talk about that, and I talk about, it does kind of seem to have these Crowleyan overtones, and there's whispers that Kubrick wanted to use Crowley's voice during the ritual scenes, but for some reason he couldn't. And so he used Orthodox chant in reverse. It's Romanian Orthodox, which suggests obviously satanic, since it's being reversed. Excuse me. So you get this kind of super elite that are, in a Nietzschean sense, beyond good and evil. I'm not saying they really are, but I'm saying in the film they're presented this way, and they're kind of like shoving it in Bill's face that, oh, you want to keep going down this path? Well, here's what's at the bottom of this rabbit hole. Do you really want to go here? And there's other aspects of the film that you could debate whether or not Nicole Kidman's character was a part of it all along. Who knows? But so that's what I mean. It's a kind of gaslighting is not the right word. I just thought it was interesting that I think because Jay Weidner makes the point that 2001 begins with the screen being very closely linked to the monolith, and then it seems to kind of be a ritual initiation. I thought, well, actually, the same kind of thing's going on with Eyes Wide Shut, because the people watching it are really the character of Bill Harford, most likely.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, the upper middle class, perhaps,
and thinking that they know, right? And this is what characterizes the professional class, we might say. They went to the university. They've invested in the system, so they know how the world works, right? Well, I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I know how the world works. But in fact, they do not.
Yeah, their ego and their contentedness blinds them to the reality of things.
Yeah, and that's why you have so many references in the film to, there's other aspects that I didn't really go into, like Freudianism, and there's Jungian archetypes, and there's references to sociology quite often. When Bill is in Domino's apartment, she's got a shelf full of Carl Jung and sociology books. It's interesting for a street hooker to have this kind of.
And her appearance, she doesn't look like your typical street hooker.
Exactly, right.
I mean, she's a high. If anything, if she's in that line of work, she's a high.
And there's a lot of irony in that. It's like, Bill, come on, like he should be catching on. You see what I'm saying? And so he's a willing fool, and I think that that's illustrative for a lot of the public in terms of, like, come on, you ought to be catching on by now, right? Like, the story of 9/11 doesn't make sense. Come on, right? It's like, you don't really get how the world really works. So I think that's what Kubrick's probably saying. And I'm not trying to import motives to, because I don't know Kubrick's motives, but, you can interpret that how you will, but I think he does continually have this theme of trying to show you how the world is really operating, what's really going on.
I think you make this point, or at least you allude to it, how the voyeuristic element of it.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
And that itself has a degrading effect on the audience. It introduces this world to you, and in a way kind of normalizes it, because if this stuff happens, if these transgressions are occurring, and nothing is done about it, it normalizes it gradually in the eyes of the public. That's a good
point. Yeah, and it also kind of says that, in a way, viewing the film might be hypocritical, because, one could possibly, one could argue as pornographic, especially towards the end. Well, the scene at the end, of course, or toward the middle end, whatever. The ritual scene.
Yeah, which right. I understand was supposedly more graphic and was edited. So.
That was edited supposedly, right? Yeah. And I've not searched out the full version or whatever. There's enough in there, but what I think is interesting in that regard is that it's a lot worse than that, in the sense of it's probably, in other words, what really goes on is Dutroux affair. It's what we believe might be going on with Podesta. That's probably what's really going on.
Yes.
And so it's a lot worse than people just having sexual liaisons or trysts or whatever.
And the idea of throwing up all these, willing and available beautiful women and walking around with nothing on, and to the middle class with some semblance of, of more sexual, of inhibition in matters regarding sex and morality, it's like, they're laughing at middle America.
There you go.
Middle class values and decency, and ultimately, it's that, because anything when you bring in sexual, when you do away with sexual inhibition or some sort of idea of sexual morality, is a natural reduction occurs. You commodify and you cheapen human life, because obviously you're treating other human beings as objects without some sense of morality when it comes to sex. So I was listening to Hoaxbusters the other day, and Chris was talking about this. The Comet Pizza pedophile thing. And he was saying he's no doubt that this is going on. Now, whether this revelation, this evidence is real or not, isn't really significant. The point he was making, he was saying the whole point of all this stuff is to get it out there, get people talking about it. Just to get you talking about it degrades you somewhat because it desensitizes you. And he was going off about the Monica Lewinsky scandal and how that was sort of a ritual of initiation to degrade the public a bit more, because what that really sparked was all this open talk about fellatio. And pretty soon you had them talking about, and 8th graders were talking about it because it was in the news. You have the news talking about it.
Yes, that's a good point. There's some kind of balance here. I don't know that I have the answer, but for example, the Bible itself is not very prudish. There's quite a bit of graphic and violent and just perversion aspect. There are perverted aspects of the Bible for the purpose of instruction. In many cases, they have the hooker, I believe in Judges, being chopped up. You have, the case of Solomon and his many wives. You got all kinds of stuff like this.
Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah.
Sodom and Gomorrah, exactly. Funny story. Some of the Puritans, by the way, would not preach certain parts of the Bible because they thought it was too lurid to mention, which is interesting given that they believed in the inspiration through the Holy Spirit. But in other words, if the texts are inspired, then you'd have to argue that the Holy Spirit was being lurid, which is stupid. But so there's some kind of balance here because the Bible, even gives us stories that are instructive for that purpose But I think the problem is that when you have a society that's so debased and so bombarded with this toxic sexual psychological warfare, it becomes a situation where they don't have a moral compass from which to even be able to make those kinds of distinctions, if that makes sense. In other words, if you take another example, like say cocaine or opiates. Now, in my opinion, my view, cocaine and opiates and so forth, since 100 years ago or so, used to be sold at a drugstore. In a more healthy, functioning society, it makes the most sense to me that those things should be sold in a drugstore. I think that's rational, perfectly reasonable, makes sense. Now, so people who might be, say, libertarians would argue, no, we can't do that anymore, or we got to go back to that. But the problem is that the society at that time was a lot healthier, I would say. I understand there were problems, but this was, prior to the 60s revolution and so forth. And so if the society as a whole doesn't even have a moral compass, it's, I would say, even more dangerous perhaps to try to go back to some older, more liberal, I guess. I don't mean liberal in the political sense, but liberal in an economic sense of, being able to go buy cocaine at a drugstore. In other words, we've been so debased that it would probably be even worse now.
Because the degradation, the societal conditions are such that people don't have the inner controls that are necessary for external freedom.
Self-government, right?
Yeah.
And so if the same kind of a point could be made probably about how you approach and discuss very degrading and perverse actions on the part of cults or the elite or whatever. I mean, then again, on the other hand, it also kind of puts it in the face of people it almost forces people to realize that there is real evil, because what I see is a lot of people denying, like they won't even consider the possibility, because if they did consider that possibility, they would have to admit, there's actually something genuinely evil in the world, and that presupposes that there's good and probably God, right?
Yeah, yep.
And so it's part of the left's, psychology to justify and to deny evil. Right? Evil, quote unquote, can only be some sort of psychological aberration or chemical imbalance or something. It can't be any kind of real spiritual force, because that then brings us back to metaphysics and God.
Yeah, it's like the priest in The Exorcist, Father Damien, who at first thinks he's a psychiatrist, and he thinks, this is,
yes, there you go.
This is crazy. It's obviously a psychological disorder, and all of a sudden, she goes to all these tests, and all the doctors look at her, and they find their conclusion is you might want to think of an exorcism.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that's sort of the point I try to make in the next chapter of The Shining, where I argue that, whatever you think of Stephen King or Kubrick, the story seems to be about demonic possession. It's not really about ghosts. I mean, in a loose sense, it's ghosts. But the real monster in the story, the real minotaur of the labyrinth, is Jack, the dad. Mm-hmm. Now, you could argue Kubrick does have this tendency towards kind of class warfare and Marxist elements in his movies, especially something like Spartacus. And he does take generally kind of a critical attitude towards America, which, in the 60s and 70s and so forth, that would have been seen as very radical, and how dare you critique America. But a lot of the points that he's criticizing about America are accurate, I would say, with this elite class of degenerates. I don't think that he's accurate when he kind of throws in these critiques of patriarchy or white males. I don't believe he's right about that, but I do believe he's right about the overall sort of criticism of what America is, and that it's actually decadent, and that the middle class that we talked about earlier, they don't and can't seem to understand that. like this is just my own sort of assessment, is that, and it might have even been one of the Rolling Stones that said something like this, I can't remember, but somebody's made the point or the idea tossed out there that there is potentially more of an affinity betwixt vagabonds and bohemians and the superclass oligarchic elite, precisely because those two classes of persons tend to have seen through the lies in society. Mm-hmm. The oligarchic elite understand that they manipulate and control, and many of the con artists, the lower class vagabond bohemian types, understand that it's kind of a rigged system, right? So,
but it's the middle class that foolishly believes in the fairy tales of democracy and rule of law,
and they become the engine of the system that props it up. And that, I think, is probably why the elite tend to have such a disdain and hatred for the middle class, and they'll like somebody who's some sort of bohemian or something.
Yeah, and the irony is that in order to approximate a society that actually does respect something approaching the rule of law, justice, decency, and fairness, you have to first acknowledge that we're nowhere near it right now. That's not the status quo.
Right, but as Chris often says, and I think he's right, America is viewed kind of like a cult. People really worship. There's a lot of power in patriotism, which I don't think is inherently bad. But America has become a kind of giant cult thing that people worship the idea of. And
we see that in sporting events with the militarism.
Yes, and, exactly.
The idea is that to be patriotic is to support blowing up brown people. And
you don't ever really look into the idea of why we're doing this or what the reasoning is here. It's just kind of sort of blindly follow along.
Or the fact that it's also the source of so many domestic problems, whether it's either family breakup, dissolution, or just
or all the troops coming back and committing suicide and having mental problems.
And even troubles like immigration issues regarding, Europe's getting it. They're being targeted for various reasons, but also the destabilization, the decades of destabilization that's occurred in Latin America.
This is JJ Book Against the Law.